A man stares at a number on a screen in a quiet office in southern Utah, and the number is wrong. Not wrong like a typo, wrong like a smoke alarm going off in a house nobody lit a match in, because that number is supposed to be the safest, most stable, most carefully insured measurement in the entire American Southwest. And instead, it is sliding day after day toward a line that the people who built this place swore, in writing, in concrete, in 100 years of treaties, could never be crossed. And the strangest, most unsettling detail in this entire story is not how much water has disappeared. It's that nobody saw it coming. Not the engineers, not the politicians, not the 40 million people drinking, farming, and bathing on the other end of this slow-motion catastrophe. Because the thing draining this lake isn't a leak you can patch or a flood you can sandbag. It's invisible, it's silent, and it has been working for decades in plain sight while everyone was busy arguing about something else. And by the time you finish watching this, you will understand why scientists are now using a word they have spent their entire careers trying to avoid saying out loud, dead. And you'll understand why the answer to where billions of gallons of water went might be the most quietly terrifying thing happening anywhere in North America right now, because this isn't a story about a drought, it's a story about a bet. An entire civilization made 100 years ago, a bet on a desert that never agreed to the terms. Picture the American Southwest before any of this existed. A river called the Colorado cutting through stone for 6 million years, carving canyons so deep and so remote that almost no human eye had ever seen the bottom of them. And then, in the middle of the 20th century, one generation decided that wildness was a problem to be solved. So they built a wall, a single staggering wall of concrete called Glen Canyon Dam, and they dropped it directly across the river's throat. And the river, having no vote in the matter, began to back up behind it. And over the next 17 years, inch by inch, foot by foot, it drowned an entire canyon system, swallowing alive a hidden wonderland of red sandstone cathedrals, secret slot canyons, ancient dwellings carved by people who had called. This place home 1,000 years earlier, all of it vanishing under rising water while the rest of the country celebrated what they were building, instead of mourning what they were erasing, and what rose in its place was Lake Powell, a reservoir so large it sounds almost fictional, nearly 8 trillion gallons at full capacity, stretching back nearly 200 miles into the desert like a drowned fingerprint pressed into the earth. And for the engineers who built it, this wasn't just a lake, it was a promise, a savings account for an entire civilization. Fill it in the wet years, draw it down in the dry years, and no matter what the sky decided to do, the cities of the American West would never have to know. Thirst? Phoenix could bloom in 115-degree heat, Las Vegas could rise out of bare rock, millions of acres of desert could become some of the most productive farmland on the continent. And underneath, every one of those miracles sat the same quiet assumption, the same 4 words that an entire civilization staked its future on. The water will return. Except here's the part almost nobody learned in school and almost nobody talks about at dinner. That assumption was never a fact. It was a guess. And in 1922, when officials sat down to divide this river between 7 states and 2 countries, they made that guess using data from one of the wettest periods in the river's known history. They looked at an unusually generous handful of years, decided that was the normal flow, and then signed away more water on paper than the river has reliably carried in any extended stretch since, which means the math was broken before the ink had even dried, which means this crisis didn't begin last year or even last decade. It began the moment a room full of men in suits decided a desert river owed them more than it had ever actually promised. And for almost 100 years, that broken math stayed hidden, buried under the sheer size of the reserves sitting behind these dams. Because when you have 8 trillion gallons sitting in a man-made sea, a bad decade doesn't feel like a crisis. It feels like a rounding error. But a reservoir that size doesn't just sit there waiting patiently to be used. It bleeds constantly, invisibly in 3 directions at once. And almost nobody outside a handful of hydrologists has ever heard of any of them. The first thief works in the sky. Spread a flat sheet of water the size of a small sea across one of the sunniest, driest, hottest landscapes on the continent. And the sun does not show mercy. Every single year, an estimated 160 billion gallons of water rise directly off the surface of Lake Powell and disappear into the atmosphere. Gone, turned to vapor, carried off on the wind to fall as rain somewhere else entirely. That water is never poured into a glass, never sprayed on a crop, never delivered to a single one of the 40 million people counting on it. It simply leaves, and it leaves before a single drop is ever officially withdrawn, which means the system is already losing one of its biggest battles every single day before anyone even opens the tap. The second thief is even stranger, because it works in absolute silence, underground, where no camera and no gauge can follow it. Remember that this lake was created by flooding a canyon, and the canyon is made of sandstone, And sandstone is porous. Sandstone drinks press trillions of gallons of water against stone riddled with microscopic openings. And the rock does exactly what thirsty rock has always done. It pulls the water in and keeps it. Scientists estimate that more than 100 billion gallons seep out of Lake Powell every single year, soaking directly into the surrounding rock and vanishing from any ledger that could ever track it again. Picture the lake sitting inside a colossal stone sponge, quietly, endlessly drinking from the very water it was built to protect. And unlike evaporation, you cannot watch this happen. There's no shimmer in the air, no visible sign. The water is just gone, swallowed by the one material engineers chose to build their fortress out of. And then there's the third thief, the one that never ever gives anything back. Because the Colorado River doesn't just carry water, it carries sediment, sand, silt, groundstone torn from mountains, hundreds of miles upstream, and for millions of years, that material rode the river all the way to the sea. But the moment it hits the dead calm water behind the dam, it slows, it sinks, and it stays, year after year, decade after decade, piling up on the lake bed in vast, invisible dunes. Federal surveys suggest the reservoir has already lost nearly 7% of its total storage capacity this way, roughly 11 billion gallons of potential space, buried under mud every single year. And here is the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. You cannot undo this one. Evaporation might ease in a cooler year, seepage might slow if the rock ever saturates, but you cannot drain mud back out from underneath a reservoir. Every ton that settles on the bottom is space for water that is never coming back, which means even in a miracle year, even if every river upstream flooded at once, the lake could fill all the way back to its old waterline, and still hold less water than it once did, because the floor itself is quietly rising to meet the surface. Three thieves, the sky, the stone, and the silt, working every hour of every day. And for most of this lake's life, none of it mattered, because the mountains kept paying the debt. Snow fell in winter, melted in spring, and poured down into the E. Reservoir fast enough to outrun every loss. The system worked exactly the way the engineers promised it would, right up until the moment it didn't. And that moment has a name now. Scientists studying tree rings, which record centuries of wet years and dry years. Preserved in ancient wood have found something almost impossible to process. Emotionally, the American Southwest may currently be living through its driest stretch in roughly 1,200 years. Not the driest in anyone's lifetime, not the driest on record, the driest since long before this dam, this lake, these cities, or this entire civilization existed in any form. The last time conditions were this severe, there was no Phoenix, no Las Vegas, no farms, no families depending on a tap connected to a river. 2 states away. And this isn't a single brutal summer. This has dragged on for more than 25 years, occasionally interrupted by a wet winter that offers a flicker of false hope before the dryness returns right on schedule. And rising temperatures are making it worse in ways that compound on top of each other. More precipitation now falls as rain instead of snow, and rain runs off fast and disappears, while snow is supposed to act like a slow-release reservoir, melting gradually through spring and summer exactly when the system needs it most. And even when snow does fall, the heat now evaporates more of that runoff before it ever reaches the reservoir at all, so a year that looks decent on paper can still deliver almost nothing in practice, which is exactly what happened in the most recent forecasting cycle, when water managers projected the snowmelt flowing into Lake Powell at barely 1/10 of normal, one of the lowest figures ever recorded, in over a century of measurements. Think about what that means mathematically. A lake bleeding from 3 directions every single day of the year, and the one source that was supposed to refill it arriving at 10% strength. There is only one direction left for a system like that to go, and you can see exactly how far it has already gone if you know where to look, because the proof isn't hidden in a spreadsheet somewhere. It's carved directly into the rock. Anyone who visits Lake Powell today can see a pale white band running along the canyon walls for hundreds of vertical feet, a mineral stain left behind by water that used to be there and now isn't. Locals call it the bathtub ring, and it functions like a receipt, an honest physical record of exactly how much has already been lost. In some places, the water has retreated so far that boat ramps now end abruptly in cracked, sun-baked dirt. Stranded dozens of feet above water they were built to reach. Marinas have been forced to relocate or shut down entirely. An entire regional tourism economy built around houseboats and Red Rock Canyons is now watching its lake quietly drain out from underneath it. And as unsettling as that visible decline is, it's only the beginning of why. People who actually run this river are afraid, because Glen Canyon Dam isn't just a wall holding back water, it's a machine, a hydroelectric power plant that generates electricity for hundreds of thousands of homes and businesses by forcing lake water through massive turbines deep inside the structure. And that only works if the water sits high enough above those turbines to create enough pressure to spin them, which means there's a critical elevation, an invisible line at roughly 3,490 feet, called minimum power pool, and if the lake drops below it, the dams simply cannot generate electricity anymore. Not won't, cannot. The physics stop working. And for most of this reservoir's history, that line was a distant hypothetical buried in the back of a technical report. The kind of worst-case scenario engineers calculate because they're required to, not because they expect to see it. And then, recently, for the first time, federal forecasts began showing that line with an actual date attached to it, a season where the lake could touch it or cross it. Imagine spending your entire career treating a number as theoretical, and then 1 year watching a calendar date appear next to it. But minimum power pool isn't even the bottom. There's a lower threshold still, one that hydrologists speak about. The way sailors speak about reefs they've only ever seen marked on old maps. It's called dead pool. And for decades, that phrase existed purely as an abstraction. A number engineers included in reports out of due diligence, never expecting any human alive to witness it. Dead pool sits at roughly 3,370 feet, the elevation at which the water becomes too low to flow through the dam's normal outlets at all. Below that line, the dam stops being a dam that releases water downstream and becomes something closer to a wall that simply traps whatever remains. The river below would slow to a trickle, possibly stop altogether, and every single thing downstream, the Grand Canyon, the entire lower basin, the other massive reservoir called Lake Mead, the cities of Las Vegas, Phoenix, and huge stretches of Southern California, all of it would be left waiting on a river that no longer arrives. And there's a detail buried inside this that almost nobody outside the engineering community knows. The dam does have emergency lower outlets designed specifically to move water in exactly this scenario. Except inspectors recently discovered that years of pushing high-pressure water through those exact pipes has damaged them, which means the backup system built specifically to save the structure in its worst possible moment may already be partially broken before that moment has even fully arrived. Picture the full shape of what's actually happening here. A lake losing water from 3 separate directions simultaneously, a multi-century drought refusing to refill it, a power plant edging toward an automatic shutdown, a dead pool scenario that would choke off water to an entire region, and a piece of emergency equipment meant to prevent the worst outcome already compromised. That is not a single disaster waiting to happen. That is an entire interconnected system failing in slow motion on every front at once, and faced with exactly that picture, water managers were recently forced into decisions that would have sounded unthinkable only a few years earlier. They ordered massive emergency releases from a separate reservoir upstream called Flaming Gorge, sending that water rushing downstream purely to prop Lake Powell's level back up, and at the same time, they deliberately cut how much water Powell itself releases downstream into Lake Mead, the reservoir that directly supplies Las Vegas, Arizona, and Southern California, which means one reservoir is now being drained specifically to keep another one alive a little longer. And everyone in that decision-making process understands the brutal mathematics. Underneath it, you cannot solve a shortage by shuffling the same shrinking pool of water between buckets. Every gallon rushed downstream to rescue Powell. Today is a gallon that will not exist upstream the next time a dry year arrives, which based on the last 25 years is not a hypothetical, it's a certainty. This strategy buys time. It does not create water, and it works exactly until the day there's nothing left upstream to send. And because these 2 giant reservoirs are connected by gravity and nothing else, whatever Powell fails to release, Lake Mead never receives, and Mead is already fighting its own battle, sitting at historically low levels with its own pale bathtub ring climbing the canyon walls a little higher every year. And because Mead also generates hydroelectric power through Hoover Dam, even a drop of 20 additional feet at that lake could slash its electricity output dramatically. So right now, 2 of the largest reservoirs ever built by human hands, feeding 2 of the most important dams on the planet, are both sliding toward crisis simultaneously, each one's survival increasingly purchased at the other's expense. And if all of this sounds like a system that was somehow allowed to promise more than it could ever physically deliver, that's because it was the deepest, most uncomfortable truth in this entire story is that the crisis was essentially written into the original agreement. The Colorado River currently supplies water to roughly 40 million people across 7 states and into Mexico, irrigates more than 5 million acres of farmland, responsible for a huge share of the winter vegetables eaten across the entire continent, and sustains cities that should never have been able to exist in the middle of a desert. And the legal framework dividing all of that water traces back to a single agreement signed in 1922 called the Colorado River Compact, and here's the flaw sitting at the very center of it. When officials measured the river to decide how much water existed to divide up, they happened to be measuring during one of the wettest periods in its known history. And then they built a permanent binding legal structure on top of that. Unusually generous number, promising fixed, enormous quantities of water to the upper basin states, the lower basin states, and eventually Mexico, except the river, measured honestly over the long run, simply does not carry that much water. which means the system was overdrawn from the very first signature. And for decades, that gap stayed completely invisible, cushioned by the sheer enormous size of the reserves sitting behind. Lake Powell and Lake Mead, an entire region was quietly living off a savings account, withdrawing faster than the river could ever realistically replace it. And that account is now nearly empty, and there's an even deeper injustice buried inside that same flawed math, because when the river was divided up in 1922, the 30 native nations whose ancestral lands the Colorado River actually runs through were almost entirely excluded from the negotiations. Many of their water rights, despite being legally senior to nearly everyone else's, went unquantified and undelivered for generations, promised in theory, denied in practice, and now, as the river shrinks toward its true natural limits, those communities are being forced to fight for water that was rightfully theirs from the very beginning, against cities and farms that grew wealthy using it in their absence. And there is no honest version of this story where everyone simply gets what they were promised on paper, because there was never enough water to keep all of those promises in the first place. There never had been. So strip away every layer of this story, and what's left isn't a freak accident or a single unlucky year. It's the slow, entirely predictable consequence of an entire civilization built on top of a promise. A desert river was never actually capable of keeping. Water stored in rock that quietly drinks it, sitting under sky that silently steals it, during what may be the driest extended period the region has experienced in well over 1,000 years. And there is no clever engineering fix waiting around the corner. The only realistic long-term solution is for the American Southwest to permanently use significantly less water than it has grown comfortable using, less for sprawling farms, less for manicured lawns in the middle of the desert, less for the kind of unchecked growth the region has treated as an unquestionable birthright for the better part of a century. And that means brutal, unavoidable fights ahead between states, between cities and agriculture, and between everyone currently holding water rights and the native nations whose water rights were ignored from the very beginning. The water vanishing from Lake Powell is not coming back the way it left. The snowpack isn't falling the way it used to anymore. The climate that originally filled this reservoir simply does not exist in the same form today, which means the real question facing the region is no longer how to refill this lake back to where it used to be. The real question is what an entire desert civilization becomes once the buffer is finally permanently gone, once decades of paper promises finally collide head-on with the actual water physically present in the river, and 40 million people are forced to live within the genuine limits of a landscape that was, in the end, always going to set its own terms. This lake isn't collapsing in one dramatic, cinematic instant. It's failing exactly the way most enormous, complicated systems eventually do, gradually and then all at once. And here's the part that should sit with you long after this video ends. Like, Powell is not unique. All over the planet right now, entire civilizations are quietly leaning on shrinking rivers and draining ancient underground reserves, spending down a finite resource on the exact same assumption the engineers who built Glen Canyon Dam once made with total confidence, that the water would simply always be there waiting. It won't somewhere right now. A hydrologist is sitting at a desk, watching a number fall on a screen, fully understanding what it means, and the rest of us are about to find out alongside them whether we're ready or not.